This is not political theater. This is a $47 billion problem that just landed on every American's doorstep. On a cold morning in Washington, 9 justices made a decision that will force the U.S. government to refund tariffs collected over 3 years. Tariffs that were supposed to protect American jobs, but instead sparked the largest trade disruption in modern history. Right now, at this very moment, customs officials are reviewing 2.8 million import transactions. Corporate legal teams are preparing claims for billions in refunds. And the White House is facing a crisis it didn't see coming. Because the Supreme Court didn't just block a policy, it drew a constitutional line in the sand. The ruling invalidates executive authority used to impose tariffs on $370 billion worth of goods, from Chinese electronics to European steel. And the fallout? It's cascading through supply chains that took years to build, contracts signed under now invalid assumptions, and pricing strategies that must be rewritten overnight. Stay with me, because this isn't about legal theory. It's about whether your next phone costs less or whether American factories lose their competitive edge. It's about Warren Buffett warning investors that policy unpredictability is more dangerous than the tariffs themselves. And it's about what happens when the highest court in America tells a former president you went too far. Now I'm going to show you what really happened. The Supreme Court building. Marble columns, silence broken only by the shuffle of legal briefs and the weight of history. At 10:07 a.m. Eastern Time, the majority opinion was delivered. Temperature inside a controlled 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside 34 degrees Fahrenheit, overcast, pressure building. The ruling itself spans 87 pages. 6 justices in the majority, 3 dissenting. The decision targets tariffs imposed unilaterally under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, a statute designed for genuine national security threats, not broad economic protectionism. The Trump administration had used this authority to levy tariffs on steel, aluminum, automobiles, and consumer electronics from 14 countries. Total value affected $370 billion in annual imports. Fees collected since 2018, approximately $47 billion. But this wasn't just about trade policy. This was about constitutional boundaries. The court found that the executive branch had exceeded its statutory authority, acting without the congressional approval required for tariffs of this scale and scope. And in that 87-page ruling, buried in the legal reasoning, was a single sentence that changes everything: executive discretion is not unlimited. The implications ripple outward immediately. Treasury officials, already managing inflation concerns and a $31.4 trillion national debt, now face the bureaucratic nightmare of processing refund claims. Corporations are mobilizing legal teams, investors are recalculating portfolios. But this is just the beginning. The mistake wasn't obvious at first. In fact, it was deliberate. The Trump administration believed it had found a legal loophole, a way to impose sweeping tariffs without navigating the slow, messy process of congressional approval. Section 232 had been invoked only 29 times since 1962, and never on this scale. White House advisors argued that imported steel threatened U.S. defense capabilities, that foreign aluminum could compromise military supply chains, that automotive imports posed economic security risks. But here's the problem: 11 of the last 13 similar executive tariff actions had faced legal challenges, and 8 of those were either overturned or significantly modified by courts. The pattern was clear, yet the administration pushed forward, confident that executive authority would hold. Between 2018 and 2021, tariffs were imposed in waves. First steel and aluminum, then washing machines, then solar panels, then $250 billion worth of Chinese goods. Each time, legal experts warned this is constitutionally fragile. Each time, political advisors countered, we need to act fast. Congress won't move quickly enough. And so the tariffs accumulated. Fees piled up, companies adjusted, supply chains shifted. And the legal challenges mounted quietly in federal courts until they reached the Supreme Court, where precedent, constitutional limits, and statutory language collided with executive ambition. Now I'm going to show you why this matters. While the White House was imposing tariffs, another force was quietly gathering evidence. Legal teams from 127 corporations, trade associations from 19 industries, and international trade lawyers from 8 countries began coordinating challenges. They built a case brick by brick, document by document. They analyzed every tariff imposed, cross-referenced statutory authority, mapped legislative history going back to 1962. They used data modeling software to demonstrate economic harm, $83 billion in additional costs passed to consumers, 142,000 jobs lost in import-dependent industries, retaliatory tariffs from China, the EU, and Canada affecting $28 billion in U.S. exports. The details here matter, because this wasn't just legal theory, it was forensic economics. Trade economists at MIT, Stanford, and the Peterson Institute provided analysis showing that for every job saved by tariffs in steel production, 3.2 jobs were lost in steel-consuming industries. Automotive manufacturers submitted data showing that tariff-related cost increases averaged $1,742 per vehicle. Electronics companies documented supply chain disruptions affecting 6.7 million shipments. And then there was the constitutional argument. Legal scholars prepared briefs citing 47 precedents where courts had limited executive trade authority. They highlighted the separation of powers doctrine. They emphasized that Congress, not the president, holds authority over taxation and trade under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. By the time the case reached the Supreme Court, the challengers had built an airtight argument, and that's where everything begins to change. So here's the question that will define American trade policy for the next decade. Can a president unilaterally reshape the economy using national security as justification, even when the real motive is political or economic protectionism? That's what the Supreme Court had to decide. And the answer carries consequences that extend far beyond this single case. Because if the answer is yes, then executive power has no meaningful limit in trade policy. Future presidents could impose tariffs on virtually any import, bypass Congress entirely, and reshape international commerce at will. Markets would operate in perpetual uncertainty. Trade partners would view agreements as fragile. Investors would price in constant policy volatility. But if the answer is no, if the court draws a line, then it reaffirms that even in moments of political pressure, constitutional constraints matter. It means Congress, not one person, decides taxation. It means checks and balances aren't theoretical, they're enforceable. The court chose no, and in doing so it triggered a cascade. Within 73 minutes of the ruling, stock futures dropped 1.8%. Treasury bond yields shifted as traders recalculated fiscal projections. Currency markets reacted to the possibility of $47 billion in refunds flowing back into corporate balance sheets. Warren Buffett, in a statement released that afternoon, said predictability is the foundation of investment. This ruling reminds us that policy built on shaky legal ground creates risk that no financial model can fully capture. Now I'm going to show you the answer. The ruling hit at 10:07 a.m. By 10:14 a.m., the White House counsel's office was in emergency session. By 10:31 a.m., the Treasury Department had convened a crisis task force. And by 11:02 a.m., the first corporate refund claims were being filed electronically. This was phase one, the immediate legal and financial scramble. The Supreme Court's decision didn't just invalidate the tariffs, it created a legal obligation. Under federal law, when tariffs are ruled unconstitutional, refunds must be processed. But here's the complexity. Those refunds aren't simple. Every tariff payment since 2018 must be reviewed, documentation verified, exchange rates recalculated, interest potentially applied. The Treasury Department estimates 2.8 million individual transactions are affected. Processing time per claim, approximately 47 minutes of staff review. Total processing hours required 2.19 million hours. At current staffing levels, that's 14.6 months of continuous work. But companies aren't waiting. Within the first 6 hours, claims totaling $8.3 billion were submitted. Legal firms specializing in trade law saw their caseloads triple overnight. And the psychological effect? Immediate. Supply chain managers who had spent 3 years adapting to tariffs now faced a new reality: the costs they built into contracts, the suppliers they switched to, the domestic production they invested in, all based on tariff assumptions that no longer exist. For some, this is relief. For others, it's chaos. Shipping routes optimized for tariff avoidance now make no economic sense. But this wasn't anything compared to what would follow next. If you're finding this analysis valuable, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and leave a like, because what comes next is even more important. Phase 2 began when international trade partners realized the opportunity in front of them. Within 18 hours of the ruling, the European Union Trade Commissioner released a statement: "We will pursue compensation for retaliatory measures undertaken in response to what have now been ruled illegal tariffs." China's Ministry of Commerce followed 4 hours later with similar language. Canada's trade minister scheduled emergency consultations. This wasn't just about refunds anymore. This was about renegotiating the entire trade relationship. Countries that had imposed counter tariffs on U.S. goods affecting $28 billion in American exports now had leverage. They could demand compensation, revision of trade terms, preferential access to U.S. markets, and they moved quickly. The EU submitted a formal request to the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, seeking $4.7 billion in compensation for economic harm caused by the now invalidated tariffs. China signaled it would seek appropriate remedies for disruptions to $83 billion in bilateral trade. Meanwhile, American exporters caught in the crossfire faced a new problem. Retaliatory tariffs imposed by other countries were based on U.S. tariffs that no longer exist. Would those retaliatory measures be lifted? When? Under what terms? Farmers in Iowa, manufacturers in Ohio, and tech companies in California, all affected by retaliatory tariffs, suddenly had no clear timeline for relief. Market analysts calculated that full unwinding of trade distortions could take 18 to 24 months. But even that assumed cooperation. And cooperation wasn't guaranteed. Yet even this escalation wasn't the critical point. Phase 3 hit when the political reality collided with economic necessity. Inside the White House, the debate was no longer about legal strategy, it was about survival. Senior advisors split into two camps. One group argued for immediate conciliation, acknowledge the ruling, work with Congress on new trade legislation, stabilize markets through clear communication. The other group pushed for defiance, frame the court as judicial overreach, rally political support, and signal that the administration would find alternative means to protect American industry. But while internal debates raged, external consequences accelerated. On day 3 after the ruling, Ford Motor Company announced it was recalculating pricing on 83,000 vehicles in inventory, each potentially $1,400 cheaper without tariff-inflated steel costs. By day 5, Best Buy, Home Depot, and Amazon had begun preliminary reviews of pricing for 2.7 million product SKUs affected by tariff removals. By day 7, the stock market had fully absorbed the shock, but in unexpected ways. Steel stocks dropped 11.3%. Aluminum producers fell 8.7%. But retailers rallied, tech stocks climbed, and import-heavy industries saw gains. The market was recalibrating winners and losers in real time, and then came the political flashpoint. A congressional hearing was scheduled. The Treasury Secretary was called to testify. Questions were prepared. How much will refunds cost? How will you fund them? What happens to industries that relied on tariff protection? And in that hearing room, under oath, facing elected representatives, the executive branch had to answer for policies the Supreme Court had ruled unconstitutional. Now I'm going to show you the real impact of this. Step back and look at the full picture. This Supreme Court decision isn't an isolated event, it's part of a pattern. In the last 40 years, federal courts have struck down or limited executive trade actions 23 times. This ruling is the most significant. It resets the balance between executive authority and congressional oversight. It clarifies that national security justifications for tariffs must be genuine, not political cover for protectionism. And it sends a signal to future administrations: unilateral trade policy carries constitutional risk. The economic implications extend far beyond immediate refunds. Over 3 years, these tariffs cost American consumers an estimated $83 billion in higher prices. They triggered retaliatory measures affecting $28 billion in U.S. exports. They disrupted supply chains for 47,000 companies. And they created a period of policy uncertainty that, according to Federal Reserve analysis, reduced U.S. GDP growth by 0.3% annually. That's $210 billion in lost economic output. But here's what this means going forward. Any president seeking to impose major tariffs will now need explicit congressional authorization. Trade policy becomes slower, more deliberate, more transparent. That's frustrating for those who want rapid executive action. But it's reassuring for markets, investors, and trade partners who value predictability. Warren Buffett put it plainly, the rule of law isn't an obstacle to economic policy, it's the foundation that makes stable policy possible. International partners are recalculating U.S. reliability. Investors are adjusting risk models. And Americans are watching to see whether prices actually drop or whether the complexity of unwinding tariffs creates new problems. And this brings us to the final question. So here's the final question. Was this ruling a victory for constitutional governance, or a constraint that will limit America's ability to respond to economic threats? The answer depends on who you ask. For those who believe in checks and balances, this is a clear win. The Supreme Court reminded the country that no president, regardless of party or popularity, can bypass the constitutional structure. Executive power has limits. Congress controls taxation and trade, and courts will enforce those boundaries. That's not weakness. That's the system working as designed. But for those who argue that America needs agile trade policy to counter China, protect strategic industries, or respond to economic crises, this ruling is a problem. It means slower decisions, more legislative negotiation, less executive flexibility. In a world where economic threats move quickly, some say constitutional constraints can be dangerous. Both perspectives have merit, but what's undeniable is this: the Supreme Court's decision creates a new reality. Future trade policy will be shaped more by Congress, and less by unilateral executive action. Markets will operate with greater legal certainty, and international partners will approach U.S. trade agreements with renewed confidence that commitments are durable. The White House now faces a choice: work within constitutional limits, or test them again and risk another defeat. For $47 billion in refunds, 2.8 million transactions, and countless supply chains in flux, the answer will define American trade policy for years to come. We'll continue watching.